Imagine the last 8 minutes of light you will ever see. We have spent millennia worshiping the sun, the celestial engine that drives our every breath. We assumed it was eternal. We were wrong. This isn't just a story about the end of the world. It's about the terrifying silence that swallowed the light. It was a day the sky didn't just go dark, it went hollow. It was a Tuesday, 2:14 p.m. In the bustling streets of New York, London, and Tokyo, life was moving at its usual frantic pace. People were caught in the mundane, rushing to meetings, laughing over coffee, or stuck in traffic. No one looked up. No one sensed the cosmic gears shifting. Then it happened. The light didn't just dim, it curdled. The very quality of the atmosphere changed, turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Shadows on the pavement began to stretch and sharpen, distorting into jagged shapes that seemed to vibrate with a life of their own. A sudden, unnatural chill swept across the globe. It wasn't the coolness of a passing cloud. It was a deep, bone-piercing frost that felt as though it were coming from inside the marrow. Birds, usually mid-song, suddenly plummeted into a deathly silence, retreating into the thickest brush. Dogs began to howl, a primal, mournful sound that echoed through empty suburbs. On the surface of the sun, the unthinkable was occurring. Massive, irregular black patches were blooming across its golden face, like ink dropped into water. These weren't sunspots. They were voids, dead zones where the sun's fire was being systematically extinguished. Panic didn't strike all at once. It bled into the streets slowly, as millions realized that the warmth of the star they took for granted was being choked by an invisible hand, while the world below descended into a frantic prayer. The situation inside the pressurized bunkers of NASA and the ESA was far more dire. Alarms that had never been triggered in 50 years were screaming. Scientists stared at their monitors, their faces illuminated by the frantic red strobe of emergency lights. The sun wasn't just fading. It was screaming in a frequency that defied every law of physics we had ever written. For centuries, the sun had a heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic solar cycle. But now, the telescopes were recording a pulse. It was a jagged, artificial vibration emanating not from the core, but from the surface. It was the sound of a star being hijacked. "It's not a solar flare," a senior astrophysicist whispered, her voice cracking as she watched the data stream. "Something is feeding." The sun's magnetic field was collapsing inward. The solar winds, the very breath of our star, had stopped. Instead of radiating energy outward to the planets, the sun's power was being siphoned toward a single, localized point in the void. A parasite of cosmic proportions had latched onto our star. It was an entity so massive, so advanced, that it treated our sun like nothing more than a battery to be drained. The realization was a physical blow. Humanity had spent decades looking for signals from the stars, hoping for a hello. We never imagined that first contact wouldn't be a greeting. It would be an act of supreme theft. We were collateral damage in a cosmic refueling. And as the last of the sun's natural light reached Earth, the final 8-minute legacy of a dying star, we were left to face a void. A darkness so absolute, it didn't just blind the eyes, it erased the soul. 8 minutes. In the grand tapestry of the universe, it is less than a blink. But on that day, those 480 seconds became the longest funeral march in human history. You see, light is a traveler. Even if the sun were to vanish in an instant, its ghost would still haunt our skies for 8 minutes. We were living in a beautiful lie, bathed in the warmth of a star that was already dead. As the official word leaked from the space agencies, a paradoxical silence fell over the Earth. The sun was gone, completely extinguished, yet the sky was still blue. The grass was still green. Children were still playing in parks, squinting against the brightness of a light that no longer had a source. It was a haunting, ethereal experience. To look up and see a sun that you knew, with scientific certainty, was no longer there. It was like looking at a photograph of a loved one who had just passed away, a frozen moment of life, suspended in a vacuum. On social media, the countdown timers appeared. 6 minutes remaining. 4 minutes. 2 minutes. People didn't run for cover. There was nowhere to hide from the dark. Families gathered on porches, holding each other tightly, watching the last natural light they would ever know. There was no screaming now, only a heavy, suffocating anticipation. We were the first generation of humans to witness the literal end of time. Every second felt like a heartbeat thumping in the throat. The shadows were no longer just shapes. They felt like predators waiting for the light to fail. We watched the horizon, waiting for the curtain of the universe to fall. When the darkness finally hit, it didn't just fall. It slammed into us like a physical wall. But as our eyes adjusted to the starlight and the world's most powerful telescopes turned toward the solar coordinates, we realized the truth was far worse than a dying star. The sun hadn't burned out. It had been encased. High above the atmosphere, the James Webb and Hubble successors captured images that shattered our understanding of reality. Where the sun should have been, there was no longer a glowing orb. Instead, there was a jagged geometric silhouette of impossible proportions. A megastructure, a web of dark, non-reflective material, was unfolding like the wings of a cosmic moth, wrapping itself around our star. This was the void. It wasn't an empty space. It was a physical entity. A Dyson-like shell, constructed with a technology so advanced it made our greatest achievements look like wooden toys. The horror wasn't just in the darkness. It was in the realization of our own insignificance. We weren't being attacked. We weren't even being noticed. To whatever built this structure, humanity was nothing more than an ant colony living near a construction site. They didn't want our gold, our water, or our souls. They wanted our energy. They were harvesting our God to power their own civilization. The void was a parasite, and Earth was merely a discarded scrap of meat left to freeze in the shadow of a stolen sun. The first contact didn't come in a handshake. It came with the absolute theft of our future. Entropy is a silent killer. We never realized that the sun was the only thing holding back the absolute zero of the cosmos. Without it, the Earth didn't just get cold. It became a tomb of ice. The oceans, once the cradle of life, began to groan and shatter as the frost claimed them. We were the masters of the world yesterday. Today, we are just rats scurrying into the dark, praying for a spark. As the last traces of solar heat bled into the vacuum of space, the global temperature plummeted with terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, the mercury dropped to minus 60 degrees Celsius. The great skyscrapers of New York and Dubai became crystalline pillars, their steel frames moaning under the weight of the flash freeze. The power grids, the nervous system of our civilization, flickered and died. Transformers exploded across the continents as the demand for heat surpassed every physical limit. Humanity's glittering lights were snuffed out one city at a time until the planet looked like a dark, scarred marble floating in the abyss. The surface was no longer habitable. The atmosphere itself began to thin and settle like a shroud. Survival meant retreat. In a desperate, uncoordinated exodus, millions fled into the belly of the earth. Subways became shelters. Deep-core mines became cities. Ancient bunkers became the final bastions of the human race. We traded our sprawling empires for cramped, humid tunnels, huddling around geothermal vents like primitive ancestors. Above us, the wind howled across a dead world, and the stars, once beautiful and distant, now looked like cold, judgmental eyes watching our slow extinction. Silence has a sound. In the absolute dark of the underground, we listened. We expected the quiet of the grave, but what we found was a heartbeat, not a human one, and certainly not natural. It started as a hum in our dead radio sets, a rhythmic, piercing static that didn't just fill the air. It felt like it was rewriting our very thoughts. In the deep-sea cable stations and hardened military outposts that still had battery power, the monitors began to twitch. Amateur radio operators, huddled in their bunkers, picked it up first. It wasn't a random hiss of cosmic radiation or the chaotic roar of a solar storm. It was a signal, precise, mathematical, cold. It bypassed our firewalls and saturated every frequency from the lowest rumble to the highest screech. It was a broadcast, echoing from the very coordinates where our sun used to be. The world's remaining cryptographers worked by candlelight, desperate to translate the voice of the void. But there were no words. There was no greetings or surrender. The signal was a stream of prime numbers, geometric constants, and high-dimensional equations. It wasn't meant for us. We were like ants listening to the schematics of a skyscraper being built on top of their hill. The signal was a technical log, a machine-to-machine handshake between the megastructure and its distant masters. We realized with sickening dread that the sun wasn't just being drained. It was being reprogrammed. The void wasn't just a thief. It was a cosmic engineer, and the broadcast we were hearing was the sound of our solar system's final deletion. We always thought that if aliens came, they would want our gold, our water, or our souls. We were wrong. They didn't want anything from us because, to them, we didn't exist. We were just ants living in a gas station, and they had come to fill their tank. The void wasn't a ship, it was a siphon. A Dyson Parasite, designed to bleed a star dry to power a civilization we couldn't even imagine. The deep space imaging finally cleared the distortion. What we saw shattered our collective ego. A lattice of dark, non-reflective material, a Dyson swarm of impossible complexity, had physically latched onto the sun's photosphere. It wasn't just blocking the light. It was harvesting the plasma. Massive, translucent umbilicals of dark matter were tethered to the sun's equator, siphoning off billions of tons of solar material every second. This was the parasite. It was an automated, self-replicating machine mind that had traveled across the light years with a single purpose: to turn our sun into a battery. The most terrifying realization wasn't the theft. It was the indifference. There were no demands for surrender, no diplomatic channels. The architects of the void didn't even bother to shield the Earth from the lethal drop in temperature. To them, the extinction of 7 billion humans was merely collateral damage, a rounding error in a cosmic balance sheet. We were starving for heat, while they were stealing it to power a world we would never see. We weren't being conquered. We were being ignored to death. Humanity has a long history of refusing to go quietly into the night. We have fought plagues, wars, and disasters, but we have never fought a god. On that final day, huddled in the freezing dark, we didn't look for a miracle. We looked for our fire. If they wanted to steal our sun, we would make them pay for every spark. In the silence of the underground bunkers, the world's remaining governments made a pact. If we were going to die, we would die screaming into the abyss. This was Project Prometheus. Every nuclear warhead remaining on the planet, thousands of ICBMs once meant for each other, were repurposed for a single target: the void. Space shuttles that had been decommissioned for decades were patched together with scrap metal and geothermal-powered engines. We weren't launching a mission of discovery. We were launching a suicide strike. As the fleet broke the atmosphere, they entered a world of absolute shadow. The mission was simple but suicidal: detonate the entire nuclear arsenal of the human race at the primary node, the point where the parasite siphon met the sun's surface. We hoped to create a shock wave powerful enough to crack the Dyson shell, even if it was just for a second. The rockets looked like tiny fireflies dancing against the hide of a Leviathan. As the first warheads impacted the dark geometric hull, the void lit up with a man-made sun. It was the first time in weeks that light had touched the Earth, a flickering hope born of fire and desperation. We were the small, broken remnants of a dying race, throwing our final sparks at a monster to see if it could bleed. Victory is a bitter pill when it tastes like ash. As our nuclear fire struck the void geometric shell, we didn't just see a crack. We saw a catastrophic reaction. We thought we were breaking a cage. We didn't realize we were holding a grenade with a pulled pin. Humanity was suddenly faced with the ultimate cosmic gamble. Do we die in the freezing dark, or do we burn the fire of our own salvation? The impact of the nuclear fleet didn't shatter the Dyson structure. It destabilized it. The sensors of the remaining space stations flared with terrifying data. The parasite siphon was the only thing regulating the sun's collapsing pressure. If we succeeded in destroying the structure, the sun wouldn't just turn back on. It would undergo a premature gravitational collapse. The resulting supernova would incinerate the Earth and every living thing on it in a matter of seconds. We had fought to reclaim our light, only to realize that the void was now the only thing keeping our star from exploding. In the underground bunkers, the world's leaders fell into a haunting silence. To stop the attack meant accepting a world of eternal ice and darkness. To continue the attack meant a glorious, fiery end. We were caught between two apocalypses. This was the impossible choice. Do we survive as shadows in a frozen grave, or do we perish as the brightest spark in the galaxy? In those final hours of the war, we didn't choose fire. We chose time. We chose to call off the strike, letting the void continue at harvest, preferring a cold life over a magnificent death. We accepted our defeat to save our species. The world didn't end with a bang or even a whimper. It ended with a quiet, mutual understanding. The void stayed, and the sun remained a ghost of its former self. We learned the hardest lesson the universe has to offer. We are not the protagonists of this story. We are just witnesses to a cosmic silence that was here long before us, and will remain long after we are gone. Decades passed. The Earth didn't stay the same, but it didn't die. Humanity adapted. We built massive geothermal cities deep beneath the crust, powered by the core of our own planet rather than the star above. The surface remained a frozen wasteland, a silent monument to the world that once was. We stopped being creatures of the light and became creatures of the deep. A strange truce was formed, not through words, but through existence. The megastructure allowed enough residual heat to leak through to keep our atmosphere from freezing solid, a calculated mercy to keep the planet stable while they drained the star. The first contact wasn't a war or a conversation. It was a realization. We looked up at the blacked-out sun and saw not a monster, but a mirror. It reflected our own greed, our own hunger for energy, and our own smallness. We learned that life doesn't need a sun to be meaningful. It only needs a will to endure. As the last generation that remembered the golden age fades away, the children of the bunkers look at the stars and see not distant lights, but distant possibilities. The sun went silent, but in that silence, humanity finally learned how to truly listen to the universe.